Chapter 12. Dr. Shaw knew that the task of finding the lost city, if it still existed, would be one of the most ambitious undertakings ever attempted by man. The museum immediately promised complete cooperation and funds. But other problems remained. Could they dredge at this time? It was now early August, and, already, 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks had battered the shoreline. And even if weather permitted, were they likely to find a city that had been buried in the sea for 1,000,000 centuries? Did it even exist? How would the museum people feel if their funds were wasted on a fruitless search for a place more elusive and fantastic than Atlantis itself? All doubts were forgotten, however, when the Cartwright steamed up again from its home port in New York Harbor and stood ready for the all-out attempt to locate the sunken city. Dr. Shaw communicated their plans to Tsar, who had by now become acclimated to the atmosphere, and was able to remain outside the decompression chamber for increasingly longer intervals. His size and strange appearance were by now so familiar to Lorry and the boys that they regarded him almost as one of them. They had developed a strong sympathy for the lizard man, alone in a world so far removed from his own. "So will go with us when we make our search," Dr. Shaw reported. "He has indicated that he can survive at great depths for hours, and he will be invaluable in locating the city." The great day dawned calm and bright. At breakfast aboard the Cartwright, Dr. Shaw announced that weather conditions were satisfactory, and that a party of 5 would go down with Tsar to locate the site of the city. The lizard man had been smuggled aboard the night before while the crew was off on shore leave. He was hoisted amidships in a large equipment crate and then concealed in the decompression tank. It had been decided to give all but a handful of the crew the morning off so that there would be less chance of the huge green giant being seen. Still aboard were a radio operator, who seldom ventured above decks during his shift, and Captain Lang. Only 2 other crew members remained aboard, one on watch, and the other to handle the equipment and signal line. Sometime after breakfast the divers zipped themselves into their wetsuits and climbed down the ladders into the sea. At the last moment, Tsar emerged from the tank and plunged in after them. He swam slowly in the lead, followed by Stan, Lorry, Jordan, Gary, and Dr. Shaw. Professor Kincaid had remained on board, ruefully observing that his age and a heart condition prevented him from joining the search party. Soon Shah and Stan were swimming side by side, as Stan was to guide them back to the cavern. Then, using the cavern as a focal point, the lizard man would attempt to locate the sunken city. He had indicated that the only entrance to the city was through an elaborate airlock within a tunneled cliff, located some 100 yards from his burial crypt. In a short time, the swimmers reached the ocean's bottom and made their way along to the roof of the cavern. Then Tsar once again took the lead. Slowly he guided them in a northwest direction, tracing a path back toward the city proper. The city had once been connected to the tomb by a pressurized tunnel, Tsar had informed the doctor, but violent earth movements must have destroyed it eons ago. At intervals, Stan released a balloon marker. These rose to the surface, leaving a trail for the observers on the Cartwright to follow. The depth was now 60 feet. The ocean shelf continued to slope downward. Tsar waved a warning hand and the others began to tread water, while he slowly circled a tower of weathered rock. He had previously indicated that the entrance to the tunnel was several feet above the base of a giant outcrop, but the jagged tower formation he was circling was the only rise in the area. The centuries had undoubtedly eroded the landmark, but Tsar seemed to recognize some unique aspect. He waved again the signal for Stan to release a red marker. Now that the site had been located, the salvage vessel could be positioned directly above. But before returning to the surface, they made a survey of the underwater terrain. The sediment and debris of millions of years must lie atop the city's dome. It might be deeply covered. Or swift currents might have kept the organic silt relatively shallow. Unless, of course, the entire city had long since been destroyed by earthquakes, and washed away beyond recall. The others followed as he swam in a circular pattern, indicating the possible circumference of the invisible city, an area roughly a half-mile in radius. Now it was Gary's turn to place markers along the sea bottom. He attached inflated balloons on slender aluminium poles, then drove the poles into the ocean floor to keep the balloons from being swept away. At a signal from Stan, the party headed back to the ship. Tsar quickly clambered aboard, and returned directly to his hiding place in the decompression tank. "Poor fellow," Lorry murmured. "What a terrible loneliness he must feel." "The crew will be back aboard at noon," Dr. Shaw told them. "Then we'll start dredging the bottom." The Cartwright steamed to its new position in the early afternoon and the huge casing of the dredge was lowered over the side. Soon the pumps were working, and the giant mouth began to suck up the ocean bottom like a vacuum cleaner. The dredging continued until late afternoon, and to the impatient group the operation seemed endless. Every time there moved a few feet of silt, loose sediment would refill the hollow. Finally, the doctor held a chalkboard conference with Tsar. "We've been on the wrong track," he announced excitedly, a little later. "Tsar has indicated that a hollow shaft was once bored in that rock cliff down there. He thinks the shaft may still exist, probably hidden under feet of silt. It's an exit through the dome. Let's hope it's still there, even after 1,000,000 centuries." The crew were merely told to move the dredge over by the base of the rock wall, and the work continued. 2 days later the hole was uncovered. Stan's yell of triumph from below came over the loudspeaker, loud and clear. "It's here. We've got it." Lorry, the boys, and the doctor hurried into their wetsuits, and the doctor signaled their discovery to Tsar. A canvas canopy had been erected around the decompression tank. The crew members believed its purpose was to provide shade for the scientists, but now it allowed the lizard man to leave the tank and slip quietly over the side of the ship, unobserved. He and the divers quickly swam below. Stan was waving his arms slowly as they reached him. He pointed to the dark opening that had just been uncovered. It was perfectly round and had been bored straight into the rock. A plug of silt had filled it, but the dredge had sucked out this accumulation. Then Stan signaled that he was going up to change from his heavy pressure suit to scuba gear. He joined them in a few minutes. Tsar was obviously tremendously excited. He pushed into the opening and disappeared from sight. Dr. Shaw hastened after him, switching on his headlamp. The others followed in single file. The shaft was pitch black until the lights forced back the darkness to reveal a smooth tunnel that led straight down. Jordan wondered if the city was flooded. They would soon know. Tsar's huge bulk suddenly halted. Dr. Shaw moved closer to him so that his torch would reveal what lay ahead. It proved to be a dark green wall of translucent crystal. The exit was plugged solid. But Tsar's long fingers probed the edge of the wall and located a tiny black stud. He pressed it. The crystal wall slowly moved to one side and disappeared into the solid rock. At Tsar's signal, the others also swam into the wider passage. When all had entered, Tsar again activated a concealed control and the wall closed behind them. A faint humming sound vibrated through the narrow shaft. The water started to drain away, and they were standing on a crystal floor. As the soft vibration continued, Jordan discovered that the walls were slipping past his outstretched hand. The airlock was also an elevator. One moment they were in semi-darkness, the next moment the shaft was bathed in a pale blue light. They were descending through the dome of the city. Far below Jordan could see the tops of low, graceful buildings that stretched away in all directions. Their elevator was moving inside a transparent shaft that extended several hundred feet to the ground below. They had a sense of dizziness as they seemingly stood in midair, far above the crystal buildings of the city. "Good Lord!" The exclamation was Dr. Shaw's. Jordan saw he had removed his face mask. Half fearfully, he did the same, reluctant to draw the first breath. But it was fresh air, cold and thin, like mountain air. Jordan was suddenly filled with a deep respect for this ancient civilization that could build under fearsome conditions, and in so spectacular a manner. "The air system was turned on when we entered the lock," Dr. Shaw spoke in an awed tone. The elevator reached ground level, and they stepped out onto a shining crystal floor. We must be in the center of the city, Jordan thought, for the streets radiated away from them like the spokes of a wheel. The 2- and 3-story buildings were built of crystal, and reflected all the colors of the rainbow, in the strange light that poured down from a blue-white globe suspended from the center of the crystal dome. An aurora of colors, high above them delicate shadings of blue, green, pink, violet, and red, seemed to hang in midair and were reflected back by the walls of the buildings. As they walked along, led by Sir, Jordan marveled at the orderliness of the wide avenues. Not a scrap of refuse lay about anywhere, nor a single bit of evidence that living beings had once moved through these silent streets. They paused before the largest of the buildings and Sir motioned them to enter the wide concourse that led to its interior. This building was a series of long walls and dividers. The walls stood 20 feet high. But there were no ceilings. On the walls were hung flat, metal plates on which were inscribed magnificent pictures. They appeared to be photographic, but of a quality that far surpassed anything Jordan had ever seen before. Their startling, three-dimensional effect gave the viewer the feeling of looking through a window at the scenes. The explorers hurried from picture to picture with exclamations of astonishment. "Look at this one!" Laurie's voice rang out excitedly. It was a panoramic view of a marshland, and the swampy waters were filled with gigantic prehistoric beasts: the long-necked Brontosaurus with its tiny head, the monstrous Allosaurus, like a gigantic iguana, and the terrifying Tyrannosaurus. Its flaming red eyes seemed to glare directly at Laurie, and the huge jaws gaped wide to reveal two terrible rows of 6-inch-long teeth. It was almost too realistic. Instinctively she moved behind the protective backs of the men. Here, buried beneath the sea, the explorers were seeing a chapter of prehistory that mankind knew only through scattered bits of fossil and bone. This photographic record would be priceless if they could manage to bring it to the surface. They rounded another wall, and there, looming before them, was Tyrannosaurus Rex itself. Its relatively tiny arms were raised toward them, and high above the outstretched claws was the monstrously wicked face with its flaring nostrils, saber teeth, and yawning mouth. Laurie caught her breath. But the monster lizard was only a stuffed exhibit. "This was evidently the City Museum or Learning Center," said Dr. Shaw. Jordan unzipped the waterproof casing from the small Leica camera provided by the museum. With its sensitive lens and ultra-fast film he would be able to make an excellent record of this and other incredible sights, he thought. It was some time before anyone noticed that Sar was gone. Gary caught a glimpse of him far down the aisle. The party hurried after him as he entered another building. The structure Sar had entered was a massive block construction, greenish-black in color, with thick translucent walls. They had scarcely passed through the doorless opening when the wall silently began to slide shut. They were in a high-vaulted chamber that stretched hundreds of yards before them. Banks of metal tanks lined both sides of the central corridor. Each tank was topped by a crystal hemisphere containing pale blue liquid or gas. Brilliant waves of blinding light danced around each hemisphere. The humming of vast generators created a constant vibration. "Looks like it might be the city power station," Stan said, as they moved down the corridor toward Sar. The lizard man had climbed a ramp and was standing on a platform of polished ebony crystal, surrounded by a guardrail. The platform was bare of furnishings, except for a large glass screen that covered the wall behind. At one side was a series of varicolored buttons, evidently a control panel. Sar waved for them to mount the steps and join him. Seizing the stylus and pad which hung about his neck, he scrawled the information that they were, indeed, in the power station. Everything was working properly, he told them. Even though the city had lain dormant for untold centuries, it had automatically returned to life when they entered the airlock. Stepping over to the panel, Sar pressed one of the buttons and the glass screen lit up. Instantly a picture formed, and the startled audience saw a three-dimensional, exterior view of the city. "Television," muttered Dr. Shaw. Sar pressed another button and the scene changed to reveal an overhead view, as seen from the apex of the dome. Then he showed them different parts of the city, both inside and outside the buildings. Then Sar pressed a glowing red stud, and the screen was filled with dazzling color. Laurie and the men were gazing into an inferno. Blinding, blue-white light pulsated in a dark core, as if they were looking directly down a shaft. The image was almost too brilliant to bear, even after Sa slid a dark filter across the screen. Dr. Shaw let out a startled gasp. It's the power source. They must have drilled through the Earth's mantle to tap the inner core. They were looking at the molten interior of the planet, marveled Jordan, realizing that they were the first to see it. Somehow, Sa's people had managed to tap the greatest source of energy on Earth. Down through a quarter-mile of clay and ocean ooze they had gone, down through another 20 miles of rock so hot and under such pressure it had become liquefied magma. And then into the liquid metal core itself. The visitors marveled at the incredible power these first intelligent beings had harnessed, a heat so intense that it caused rock to flow like syrup, and a pressure almost unthinkable. Sa had been watching Jordan's reactions curiously, and Jordan became aware of this when he glanced up. He grinned uncomfortably. The lizard man bared his teeth in what passed for a smile, and reached for his slate. He scrawled something on it, pointed to the blazing view on the screen and held up the slate. It read, "Inner core temperature is 6,000 degrees centigrade. That's 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about the temperature of the sun's surface," Dr. Shaw stated, peering over Jordan's shoulder. Small wonder they have virtually unlimited power at their disposal. Now Sa led his visitors down the corridor, past the humming banks of machines and through a tall, arched passage, to another dead-end wall of dark green crystal. Sa waved his hand several times, breaking a faint beam of light that crossed the space in front of the wall. The seemingly solid rampart slid open and they passed through. This chamber was almost sterile in its simplicity. High walls reached to a ceiling some 20 feet above their heads. The floor was of a white rubber-like material that yielded under their bare feet. In the center of the room was a large, black leather chair with a slender rod rising from its back, then curving downward to end in a series of fine wires. To Dr. Shaw's practiced eye, the wires resembled the electrodes used in experiments to stimulate brain cells. He looked over the chair carefully and noticed a small control box attached to its back. Other than the chair, the room was devoid of furnishings. There were no windows, and no visible lighting fixtures, yet the place was well lighted. The doctor guessed that the molecules of the air itself were being activated by some invisible source to create light. In another 100 centuries, he wondered, would mankind also solve the riddle of darkness in this manner? Or would Sa reveal some of the secrets of his time to his companions? It would be odd to learn the elusive answers of the future from a creature born ages before mankind's earliest ancestor had crawled from the depths of the sea. Now Sa indicated that he wished the doctor to seat himself in the chair. The scientist hesitated, then politely declined the invitation. Sa's green eyes grew a trifle wider and he made an impatient gesture. Then, he reached behind the chair and raised a pencil-sized wand in one hand. It began to glow with a pale lavender light. Dr. Shaw opened his mouth to cry out in alarm, then quietly slumped to the floor. A moment later, the other 4 members of the party dropped beside him.